Greetings and welcome to this edition of
Positronic Hypersonic.
I'm Barry P. Cook, and I want to talk to you about the latest episode of The Walking Dead, Daryl Dixon. It was called Deux Amours, which means two loves in French. As it begins, we're on the boat that Daryl and Laurent and the boatman left from the city center on. And Daryl's talking with the boatman about how Laurent has been raised kind of soft and may not be well suited for life at the nest, depending on what life at the nest is like. When the boatman asks Daryl how he ended up in France, we get a flashback in which we see that Daryl encountered someone on the road while walking his bike with no fuel, who promised him fuel in exchange for him helping the man round up a bunch of walkers, which he does and brings them back to the camp, at which point the walkers are loaded onto a box truck with a flashing strobe light going for some reason. Back in the present, Daryl, Laurent, and the boatman have made camp on the banks of the river, and Laurent catches a fish, but then is dismayed at the idea of eating it, though Daryl and the boatman explain to him that you got to do what you got to do. Meanwhile, Izzy wakes up back at Quinn's, having slept for a long time because she was given something to help her with her bad dreams. When Quinn shows up, he asks how long it's going to be before she wants to be with him again, and she says she has to pray on it because she locked that part of herself away a long time ago. Daryl continues to show Laurent how to gut and cook a fish, in between Laurent asking him questions about his friends and what he believes in. Izzy searches around the room she's been locked in for something she can turn into a weapon. Daryl and the boatman talk about how all Daryl seems to want to do is get home because he made a promise, to which the boatman says promises can sometimes give way to circumstances and connections to other people and fighting for a good cause, to which Daryl responds by saying that when someone dies in another man's war, it's his kids that suffer, which gets passed down to their kids, causing people to forget what the cause was after a time, and that causes were never really his thing. Back in the past, Daryl puts fuel in his bike while a young kid at the camp agrees to chop wood for some of the other guys in exchange for them taking him under their wing or whatever, because he's trying to acquire some fuel himself before he goes back to his girl, whom he wants to take away from her overbearing father. So he goes to chop wood, but doesn't know how to do it. So Daryl has to show him how to do it. Izzy pretends to be interested in sleeping with Quinn and even starts to go through the motions before she tries to stab him with a weapon she's made, but then doesn't when he starts reciting the Bible, causing her to back off, at which point Quinn says it's okay, before going to another room where he runs into the lady from the club that he was never very nice to. Back in the flashback, Daryl uses a radio at the camp to talk briefly with Carol, but gets cut off before she can tell him something seemingly important about someone or something that's come back when the radio cuts out. In the present, Daryl has to kill a walker before it gets Laurent in his tent, and it turns out that the boatman, who was apparently on guard duty, got stuck to a phone pole by accident somehow, and then attacked by walkers, making him a goner and leaving Daryl with the job of finishing him off, and then getting Laurent to where he needs to go on the boat, which it turns out was cut loose from its rope by Laurent, understandably causing Daryl to lose his shit. Laurent explains that he did it because he doesn't want to lose Daryl once they get to the nest. So Daryl calms down and comforts Laurent, saying it'll be all right. Izzy contemplates slitting her wrist, but is interrupted by her breakfast being brought in. As Daryl and Laurent are walking through the forest, they hear cars approaching and hide. We then see in flashback that the kid that Daryl was trying to help at the camp found himself dead and turned, possibly at the hands of some of the other men, which pisses Daryl off, causing him to punch a dude, at which point the fight is broken up by the people running the camp, who then put them under arrest, basically. In the present, it turns out that the car that was approaching was full of bad guys looking for Laurent, Genet's men. Just as the men are about to slice Daryl across the face, Laurent shows up to make them stop, and they nab him, even though Daryl had told him to stay hidden. Quinn gives Izzy a very nice set of jewels that he says he looted from a Paris shop 12 years ago just for her, before going off to meet Genet, and she puts it on, saying they can start over, at which point he takes her with him to the meeting. Once at the meeting, he and Izzy see that the other lady has turned in Daryl, who's now being held with his new roommate, Quinn, who Genet feels betrayed her. In the past, Daryl, along with the man he was fighting with, is taken aboard the boat he escaped from before the events of the show, on which it would seem experiments on the dead continue, part of which includes keeping two different groups of walkers in separate containers, one which regularly gets fed, as it were, live people, and one which doesn't. Janae apparently wants to show Laurent off in front of a bunch of people because she thinks it's going to help her quiet descent among the people. Daryl fakes being ill and about to turn to get the guards to take him out of his cell and feed him to the walkers, at which point he kicks their asses, at which point he mounts an escape with the guy he was fighting with. In the present, as Janae speaks to a crowd, Daryl is led into a room. Back in the flashback, Daryl's traveling companion, as it were, gets killed by a walker while they're lowering a lifeboat off of the boat, which Daryl then jumps in. And then in the present, while the crowd looks on, Daryl is given a huge blade, a weapon, at the conclusion of Janae's speech before a walker is led in and shot from a distance with some kind of chemical-filled dart, which has an immediate and obvious effect on it before it's let loose and charges towards Daryl as the camera cuts to black, which is where the episode ended. So I continue to like this show. This episode, not so much as the previous ones overall, but I did very much like the parts where we saw the flashbacks and what led Daryl to find himself in France. I think it was a very good choice on behalf of the, creators and writers and so forth to lay the show out the way they did. Started off in France with no one knowing how he got there and, what all is going on with Janae's people, and then show that in flashback, which it took them a while to do because they were doing other flashbacks in the previous episodes. But I think that was a good choice because I don't think the show would have been as compelling if they told it in a linear way, where it started off with him, meeting the guy on the road and then going to the camp and then rounding up walkers and then fighting with the guy and getting put on the boat and escaping from the boat. And then from there, pick up with him getting out of the ocean or whatever onto dry land in France. I don't think it would have been as compelling told linearly. I think it's much more compelling this way because you're always wondering, well, how did he get to France and what happened next? And, I think that's a much more exciting feeling when you're looking backwards versus, just watching the story plod on in linear fashion ever so slowly as they did on the regular show most of the time. So I'm glad that they did that. I liked the part of this episode where Daryl talks to Carol over the radio. We got to hear Carol's voice and she says something to him about their back or it's back. And he's like, who's back? What's back? I think she's talking about Rick and Michonne, but we'll have to see because they're, of course, getting their own show. So we'll have to see if that's what she's talking about. What I didn't understand was why they bothered to make camp at all. Like at one point, he tells them it's 200 and some odd kilometers or 100 and some odd miles from where they are in the river to where they're going. And it's like, why would you bother to make camp? Like just fish off the boat and keep going and sleep in shifts, which they were doing anyway on dry land. I don't understand why that happened. I mean, obviously it had to happen for the plot, but like, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you stop and expose yourself to the possibility of walkers or other people coming and menacing you on dry land when you can just be on the boat where it's harder for anyone to get to you unless they have a boat? And obviously walkers, aren't going to be a problem. So I don't know why they did that. It didn't make sense to me, but it must just be because that's what they needed to do for the plot to get Daryl, on land and in fact menaced by the bad guys and caught. But it just didn't make sense. There's one more episode left to the season, and then it looks like we are going to get a next season. There are already another 6 episodes listed on IMDb, which makes sense. So I'm hoping that by the end, and I'm guessing we will, get to figure out what all these experiments are. And I think at the beginning of next week, when we see how Daryl gets away from this one walker that's been sicked on him, we're going to see just what that injection makes it do or allows it to do. But like, why are they feeding some and not others? And what's with the strobe light and all that business? We're going to hopefully see what that is. Anyway, that's really all there is to say about it. It was an okay episode. It served the function of telling us how Daryl got where he is, which I thought was good. But there wasn't much more to it other than that. And there were no French landmarks, which kind of annoyed me, but that's just a personal thing. There was a whole lot of French speaking. Janae gives a whole speech in French, which was interesting. But yeah, I'm going to get out of here for now. Having said all there is to say, I'll be back to do a recap and review of the season finale once it airs. Until I return, I wish you peace and long life.